The letter arrived on a Tuesday in the spring of 1878, and it changed everything about the life Olive Vaughn had carefully, painfully tried to build from the ruins of everyone else's decisions. She stood in the narrow hallway of her uncle's townhouse in Philadelphia, holding the envelope as though it were a court summons, which in a manner of speaking it was. The paper was stiff and formal, the handwriting blocky and impatient, and the message inside took no more than 3 sentences to reduce her entire future to a single cold instruction. She was to travel west by rail and then by stage to a territory called Harding Flats in Colorado, where a man named Ezekiel Doyle had agreed, through a series of arrangements made entirely without her knowledge or consent, to receive her as a housekeeper and eventual wife. Her uncle Marcus had signed the bottom of the letter in his large, self-satisfied script, and beneath his signature he had added one final line that she read 3 times before she fully believed it. "This has been arranged for your own good, as you have proven yourself unable to manage your circumstances with any dignity." She was 22 years old. She had survived the death of her father, the remarriage of her mother, the bankruptcy of her stepfather, and 3 years of living in Marcus's house, where she was tolerated the way a cracked piece of furniture is tolerated, useful enough to keep, not valuable enough to treat with care. She had worked as a seamstress for a local shop. She had kept Marcus's household accounts. She had tutored his 3 children in arithmetic and reading, and none of it had been enough to earn her the simple right to be considered a person rather than a problem. And now she was being shipped west like a crate of unwanted goods, addressed to a stranger, labeled fragile only in the sense that everyone hoped she would not make a scene about it. She did not make a scene. She packed 1 trunk and 1 valise, said goodbye to the children she had grown genuinely fond of, and walked out of the house on a gray April morning with her chin level and her eyes dry. The crying, she decided, could happen on the train where no one knew her name. The journey from Philadelphia to Denver took 4 days on the transcontinental rail, and Olive spent most of it pressed against the window of the passenger car, watching the country change beneath her like a story being told in reverse, from the cluttered, smoky certainty of the east to the wide, alarming openness of the plains, where the sky was so enormous it seemed to press down on everything beneath it with the full weight of God's own indifference. She had never seen country like this. She had read about it in newspapers and magazines, but reading about something and sitting inside it were entirely different experiences, and she found herself torn between a terror she could not quite name and something else, something quieter and more stubborn, that felt almost like interest. In Denver she transferred to a stagecoach, and it was there that the reality of her situation settled on her most heavily, because the stagecoach was carrying 4 other passengers. A land surveyor named Beaumont who spoke only about elevation, 2 brothers heading to a mining claim who smelled powerfully of tobacco, and a woman named Mrs. Clara Potts who was returning to her husband's cattle ranch and who looked Olive over with the practiced eye of someone who had spent considerable time assessing livestock and newcomers in roughly equal measure. "You're not dressed for ranch life," Mrs. Potts said, not unkindly, gesturing at Olive's gray wool traveling dress. "I'm not going to a ranch," Olive said. "I'm going to Harding Flats." Same thing, more or less. Everything in that territory is ranch life or mine life, and the mine life is worse. Who's waiting for you? A man named Ezekiel Doyle. Something shifted in Clara Potts's expression. It wasn't pity exactly, and it wasn't disapproval. It was more like recognition, the look of someone who has just placed a face they couldn't quite remember. "Ezekiel Doyle," she repeated slowly. "The man with the triple D spread just north of town." "I don't know anything about it," Olive said honestly. "He's a good man," Clara said, and her tone was careful in the way that people are careful when they want to be truthful without being unkind. "Quiet, keeps to himself. Lost his wife 3 years back and hasn't been the same since, from what I hear. The town thinks he runs his ranch alone because he likes it that way. But I've always thought he does it because he doesn't know how to stop working long enough to feel things." Olive absorbed this information in silence. She looked out the window at the rolling hills and the occasional scrub oak and the distant mountains that wore their snow crowns even in late April, as though the cold up there had never received word that spring had arrived. "He agreed to this arrangement?" she asked. "I couldn't say," Clara told her. "But I know he's a man of his word. If he agreed to it, he'll honor it. Whether that's comfort or not, I suppose depends on how you look at it." Olive looked at it from every angle she could think of for the remaining 6 hours of the journey, and she still hadn't decided what she thought about it when the stage rolled into Harding Flats just after 4 in the afternoon. The town was larger than she'd expected and smaller than she'd hoped. It had a main street with a width that suggested ambition, lined with a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon called the Copper Nail, a barber shop, a livery stable, a small church painted white with one of its shutters hanging at a defeated angle, and a building with a hand-lettered sign that read Sheriff's Office and Jail in practical black letters. There were people on the boardwalks, men in wide-brimmed hats and women in cotton dresses, children running between horse legs without apparent concern for their own survival, a dog sleeping in a patch of sunlight, with the contentment of something that has found its precise correct place in the world. The stage stopped in front of the general store, and Olive stepped down into the street and stood there with her trunk at her feet and her valise in her hand, and the whole town arranged before her like a painting she wasn't sure she wanted to step inside of. She had been standing there for approximately 2 minutes, long enough to draw the attention of several people on the boardwalk, when she heard boots on the packed dirt behind her, and turned, and saw Ezekiel Doyle for the first time. He was taller than she'd imagined, which was perhaps because she had not imagined him clearly at all. She'd kept him deliberately vague in her mind, a formless authority she hadn't wanted to make real. He was perhaps 28 or 30, lean in the way that men who work hard outdoors are lean, not from deprivation but from use, and he had dark hair that wanted to curl at the ends but had been subdued by a hat that was battered at the brim and honest about it. His eyes were the clear, deep gray of a sky just before it decides what kind of weather it's going to be, and they were fixed on her with an expression she couldn't read, not unfriendly, not exactly warm, but present in a way that made her feel, for the first time since Marcus had handed her that letter, that she was being seen rather than processed. He stopped about 3 feet from her and removed his hat, which she hadn't expected and which softened something in her chest slightly. "Miss Vaughn," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, a Colorado voice, one that wasn't in any particular rush to get to the end of a sentence. "Mr. Doyle," she said. They looked at each other for a moment. Around them, the town continued its business, but she was aware, and she thought he probably was too, that several pairs of eyes had found something more interesting to watch than what they'd been doing before. "I have a wagon out front of the livery," he said. "When you're ready." She looked at her trunk. He looked at her trunk. Then he stepped past her, lifted it with the uncomplicated ease of someone accustomed to moving things heavier than this, and carried it toward the livery without asking whether she needed help or making anything of the fact that he was providing it. She picked up her valise and followed him. The ride out to the Triple D took the better part of an hour, following a road that was more of a suggestion than an instruction, winding north through grassland that was just beginning to show its spring green, with the mountains standing in the west like something that had been there long before anyone had thought to name them. Ezekiel drove the wagon with one hand loose on the reins, not needing to think about it, and for the first several miles neither of them spoke. It was Olive who broke the silence first, because she had decided on the stagecoach that she was going to conduct herself with honesty no matter what, because she had nothing left to lose by it. "I want you to know," she said, "that I didn't ask for this arrangement. I wasn't consulted about it. I was told after the fact, like someone who'd been hired out rather than a person making a decision." Ezekiel was quiet for a moment. The horses moved steadily through the late afternoon light, which was turning golden and long across the grass. "I know," he said. She turned to look at him. "You know. Your uncle wrote me 3 letters. The first 2 were about the arrangement. The third one told me you might arrive with what he called difficult attitudes and that I should bear with you." A pause. "I wrote him back and told him I hadn't asked for a docile woman, I'd asked for a capable one, and that the 2 weren't the same thing." Olive stared at him. Something warm and unexpected moved through her, and she wasn't quite sure what to do with it, so she looked back at the road. "What did he say to that?" she asked. "He didn't write back." She almost smiled. She caught it and held it back because she wasn't ready to be disarmed yet. Not by a man she had known for 45 minutes. Not by a voice that was too calm and eyes that saw too much. The ranch appeared as they crested a low hill, a proper spread, larger than she'd expected, with a main house of solid timber and stone, a barn painted red in the way that Colorado barns were painted red, 2 outbuildings, a chicken coop, a well with a wooden cover, and a fence line that ran out in both directions as far as she could see in the fading light. There was a kitchen garden that was obviously being kept but not flourishing, the kind of garden that has been maintained by a man who understands its necessity but not its temperament. "It's bigger than I expected," she said. "I run about 400 head," he said, as though this explained everything. 2 ranch hands during the day. They go home to town at night. She understood what he was not saying, that he was here alone in the evenings, that the house had rooms that probably hadn't been used in years, that the kitchen garden was suffering from competent but insufficient attention. She understood it, and she stored it, and she did not make anything of it out loud. He showed her to a bedroom at the back of the house, near the kitchen, that was simply furnished and scrupulously cleaned, so clean that she understood he had cleaned it himself before she arrived, which told her something about him that his careful words had not quite revealed. There was a quilt on the bed in blue and white, and a small table with a wash basin, and a window that looked out over the garden and the mountains beyond. "I'll leave you to get settled," he said, standing in the doorway. "Mr. Doyle," she said. He waited. "What exactly do you want from this arrangement?" She held his gaze because she owed herself that, at least, the dignity of knowing what she'd walked into. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I want someone to share this life with, not to work for me. I have hands for that, to be here, to make it a home rather than just a place." He paused. "I know that sounds like more than you agreed to." "I didn't agree to anything," she reminded him gently. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry for that. I should have written to you directly. I should have asked." It was such a simple, honest admission of fault that she couldn't argue with it, and she couldn't dismiss it either. She nodded once, and he took that as the conversation it was and left her to unpack. She lay awake that night listening to sounds she had never heard before, the particular quiet of a place where there were no carriage wheels or factory bells, only wind and the occasional protest of a horse in the barn, and the deep, almost physical silence of mountains in the dark. And she thought about what he'd said. To make it a home rather than just a place. She had not had a home, properly speaking, since she was 16, and the word sat in her chest with more weight than she had expected. She was up before him the next morning, which clearly surprised him when he came downstairs to find the kitchen already warm from the stove and coffee on, and biscuits browning in the oven. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her with those gray eyes and said nothing for a moment. "You don't have to do this," he said. "Not right away." "I like cooking," she said, which was true, "and I needed something to do with my hands." He poured himself coffee and sat at the kitchen table and watched her move around his kitchen, not in a way that made her feel observed, but in a way that made her feel present, as though her simply being there was something he was still getting used to, and not in a bad way. His 2 ranch hands arrived mid-morning, a young man named Pete Calloway, who was about 19 and talked constantly, and an older, quieter man named Joe Rays, who was perhaps 45, and communicated primarily through meaningful silences and the occasional raised eyebrow. They both stopped short when they saw Olive in the kitchen garden, already assessing what needed doing and pulling the winter-dead stalks from between the rows of new seedlings. Pete said, "Well, hello," in the way that 19-year-old boys say hello when they are surprised by something they find appealing. Joe said nothing, but he nodded at her with a respect that felt genuine, and she returned it. Ezekiel came around the corner of the house and said, "Miss Vaughn arrived yesterday. She'll be staying at the Triple D." The way he said it left no room for commentary, but wasn't unfriendly about that either. Pete looked at his boots. Joe went back to the fence post he'd been examining. The first 2 weeks were careful and quiet. They were polite with each other in the way of people who are aware they are building something and don't want to knock it down before it has walls. He taught her things about the ranch without condescension. How to tell when the weather was about to change by watching the way the horses held their ears, which stretches of the fence line needed checking after heavy rain, which of the kitchen garden's plants were surviving and which needed replanting. She taught him things about his own house that he hadn't known he needed to know, that the chimney in the parlor was drafting wrong and needed a particular adjustment, that the method he'd been using to put up dry goods would attract mice before winter, that the quilt on the guest bed, now her bed was made in a Pennsylvania pattern she recognized from her grandmother's house and was probably worth preserving with greater care. They talked in the evenings. She hadn't expected that, hadn't expected him to be someone who talked, but he was, in the careful, specific way of a man who has had a great deal of time alone to form opinions about things and hasn't had anyone to offer them to. He had opinions about cattle breeding and irrigation and the politics of the territory and books, which surprised her most of all. He had a full shelf of them in the parlor, everything from histories to poetry to a battered copy of Moby Dick that had clearly been read more than once. And when she asked him about it, he said that a man who only knows what he can see from his front porch is only half a man. Which made her look at him sideways for a moment, and then file the sentiment away in the part of her that was becoming increasingly inconvenient to ignore. The town had noticed her, of course. Towns always notice. The women at the church that first Sunday had approached her with the careful, assessing friendliness of people who want information and are willing to be pleasant to get it. Mrs. Clara Potts had been there, and she had taken up a position at Olive's elbow with the decisiveness of someone claiming territory, which Olive was grateful for because it gave her a home base in an unfamiliar social terrain. But there was also a group of women, and one in particular, a sharp-featured woman named Helene Greer, whose husband owned the dry goods store, who had looked at Olive with a disapproval so specific it had clearly been prepared in advance. Helene had pulled Clara aside before the service and Olive had not heard the exchange, but she had caught enough of it to understand the word arrangement spoken with a particular kind of moral distaste. "Don't mind Helene," Clara told her afterward, walking her back to where Ezekiel was waiting with the wagon. She had ideas about who Ezekiel would eventually remarry, and they didn't include someone sent out from back east on an uncle say-so. Who did her ideas include? Olive asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Her niece," Clara said simply. "And what does her niece think about it?" Clara smiled. "Her niece is 17 and more interested in the new schoolteacher than in ranchers, but Helene has never let reality get in the way of a good plan." Olive climbed up into the wagon and Ezekiel glanced at her and said, "Everything all right?" And she said, "Perfectly fine." And he looked at her for a moment longer than the question required and then clicked to the horses and they headed home. It was in the third week that things shifted, as things do, not with announcement but with the quiet inexorability of seasons changing. One day you wake up, and the cold is different, and you know without being told that something has turned. She had been working in the garden on a Thursday afternoon, her sleeves rolled to the elbow in a way that would have made Marcus's wife faint, and she'd been so absorbed in getting the bean seedlings properly supported that she hadn't heard Ezekiel come up behind her until he crouched down beside her and said, "You're doing it wrong." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. "I beg your pardon. The beans. If you stake them that way, they'll grow crooked." He reached out, not touching her hands but close to them, his fingers demonstrating the angle the stake needed to be at, the way the twine should loop. Like this. She watched his hands. They were capable hands, rancher's hands, and they moved with the patient attention of someone who genuinely cared about what he was doing. "I've been gardening since I was 8, she told him. "I know," he said. "You're very good at it, except for the bean steaks." There was a warmth in his voice that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago, a dry humor she hadn't known he possessed, and she felt it arrive in her chest like sunlight coming through a cloud gap. "Fine," she said. "Show me again." He showed her again, and their hands were close enough together over the small wooden stake that she could have touched him if she'd reached an inch further. And the fact that she was thinking about that while he was talking about bean cultivation was information about herself that she wasn't sure how to organize yet. That evening after dinner, she was sitting on the porch watching the sun go down over the mountains, which she had come to think of as one of the genuinely remarkable privileges of being in this place, when he came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat in the other chair and handed one to her without asking. They watched the colors for a while. The mountains went from gold to rose to purple as though they were deciding what to be before they settled into darkness. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "Your wife, what was her name?" A pause. She had not asked before, had deliberately not asked, respecting whatever privacy he kept around it. "Margaret," he said. "Margaret Ann. You don't have to tell me about her." "I don't mind," he said, and she believed him, because his voice didn't close when he said it the way voices do when people are protecting something they haven't finished grieving. She was from Ohio. She came out here thinking it was an adventure, and she made it an adventure for 3 years before he stopped. The winter of 1875 was bad. She got sick in December. She was gone by February. "I'm sorry," Olive said, and meant it in the full, quiet way that the words deserve when they're real. "The thing I missed most," he said, and then stopped again as though he was surprised he was saying it. "The thing I missed most was just having someone else in the house. Not the everything else, just the sound of another person, the kitchen being warm when I came in." He paused. "I know that sounds simple." "It doesn't," she said. "It sounds like the most important kind of thing." He looked at her then, and she looked back, and the mountains were turning to shadow behind him, and the evening star had appeared above the ridgeline, and she thought, "I am in trouble." Not the kind of trouble she'd been in with Marcus, not the exhausting bureaucratic trouble of being a woman without resources in a world that treated that as a moral failing. This was a different kind entirely. This was the warm, alarming trouble of caring about someone before she decided to. She looked back at the mountains. "My father used to say that the best things arrive without permission," she said. "He meant it about sunsets and good books and kind people." She paused. "I think he was right." Ezekiel said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, "I think he was right too." They sat there until the stars came out fully, the whole extravagant Western display of them that she had not been able to believe the first time she'd seen it. So many and so bright that they seemed almost physical, almost close enough to trouble the tips of the mountains. And when the cold came down off the slopes and she finally went inside, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, something so unfamiliar she almost didn't recognize it. The tentative, fragile beginning of being at peace with where she was. The town's judgment, however, had not finished with her. 3 weeks after her arrival, she went into town with Pete Calloway to collect supplies at Greer's Dry Goods, and Hellis Greer managed the transaction with the kind of pointed courtesy that is designed to make the recipient feel the presence of disapproval without being able to point to a specific discourtesy. She looked at Olive's list with pursed lips, quoted prices that were approximately 10% above what Pete had told her to expect on the way into town. And when Olive quietly noted the discrepancy, Hellis said, with a smile that could not technically be called unkind, "I wasn't sure about the quality of your goods, coming from back east without much notice. We account for uncertainty in our pricing." Pete, to his credit, looked furious. He was a young man whose natural instincts ran toward fairness in the way that some people's natural instincts run toward music. But he was 19 and working for Ezekiel and unsure of his authority to make a scene. Olive paid the quoted price without comment, carried the supplies to the wagon, and when she sat beside Pete on the wagon bench she said, very calmly, "Is there another dry goods supplier within reasonable distance?" "There's Henderson's, about 6 miles further north," Pete said. "It's not as big, but the prices are fair, and Mrs. Henderson is a real decent person." "Then that's where we'll go from now on," Olive said simply. Pete looked at her with something that was very close to admiration, nodded once, and turned the horses north. When she told Ezekiel that evening, she told it as a practical matter, not as a grievance. She simply explained that she'd found a better supplier and laid out the pricing differential with the clear-eyed practicality of someone who has been keeping accounts her whole life. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said, "Hellis has been giving me trouble since Margaret died. She decided she had claims on how I run my life, and she's not pleased to find out she was wrong. I'm sorry to be the cause of difficulty." "You're not the cause," he said firmly. "Hellis is the cause, you're just the occasion." He paused, "And I'd rather have the occasion than have Hellis proved right." Olive looked at him. He was looking at her with that direct gray gaze that she was discovering she looked forward to in a way she hadn't yet decided how to discuss even with herself. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me for the truth," he said. "It doesn't cost me anything." It was the Sunday after this, at church, that things came to a head in the particular social way of small Western towns, which is that someone said something at sufficient volume that it became impossible to ignore. They had come out after the service into the warm May morning, and Hellis Greer had been standing with 2 other women near the church steps, and as Ezekiel and Olive walked past, Hellis said, clearly intending to be overheard, "It's one thing to take in a stray. It's another to parade it around as though it were proper company." The words landed in the crowd like a stone in a still pool. Several people close enough to hear went quiet. Clara Potts, who was standing 6 feet away, turned with an expression that suggested she was about to speak. But before Clara could, and before Olive had done more than feel the words arrive with that sharp, specific pain of something said to diminish you, Ezekiel stopped walking. He turned. He looked at Hellis Greer with an expression so quiet and so absolute that several people near her took an involuntary step back. "Mrs. Greer," he said, and his voice was the same unhurried voice he always used, but there was something beneath it now like the ground beneath the surface of a river, solid and immovable. "Miss Vaughn is a guest at my ranch and in this community, and I'd ask you to speak of her accordingly." "I meant no offense," Hellis said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I know what you meant," Ezekiel said, and left it there, which was more devastating than anything else he could have said. He turned back and offered Olive his arm, which he had not done before, and she took it, which she had not done before, and they walked to the wagon with the particular dignity of people who have been insulted and have declined to be reduced by it. In the wagon, driving home, she kept her hands folded in her lap and looked at the road. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally. "I did," he said. "It might make things worse for you in town." "It might." He paused. "I don't particularly care." She looked at him. His profile was set against the blue sky and the mountains, and he was looking at the road with the same calm attention he gave everything, and she thought, "This is a man who does what he believes is right and doesn't wait to see if it is applauded." She thought, "This is the kind of man her father would have admired." She thought, "I am considerably more than inconveniently in trouble." "Ezekiel," she said, and it was the first time she'd used his given name. He glanced at her. "Thank you," she said, genuinely. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the country a smile inhabits, the warm territory around one. "Olive," he said, and it was the first time he'd used hers, and she felt it somewhere in her sternum. May turned to June, and June brought the full heat of the Colorado summer, and the ranch was alive with the constant industry of the seasoned cattle to move, fences to check. the vegetable garden now growing with such enthusiasm that Olive was putting up jars of preserved things in the cool cellar under the house. She had found her rhythm here, which still surprised her sometimes. The way she would look up from something she was doing and realize she had not thought about Philadelphia for 3 full days, that the anxious background noise of feeling like an inconvenience had grown quieter. She had found friends, too. Clara Potts came by once a week with the stated purpose of various errands that Olive suspected were mostly invented excuses, and she didn't mind. Clara knew the history of this territory the way a person knows their own body, intimately and practically, and Olive found herself learning about the land and the people from her with the same deep interest she brought to everything. It was Clara who told her about the Ute settlements west of the river, and how the government's increasingly aggressive policies were displacing people who had been in this land for generations before any rancher or miner had arrived. It was Clara who explained that Joe Ray's Ezekiel's quiet senior ranch hand was of mixed Mexican and Ute heritage, and had lost land and family to those same policies, and worked the Triple D because Ezekiel Doyle was one of the few ranchers who paid fairly and asked nothing about a man's blood. Olive had already respected Joe. After this, she respected him with the full weight of knowing something about what it had cost him to be here, and she looked at the injustices around her with eyes that were open to them in a way she hadn't always known to be. She talked to Ezekiel about it one evening because she'd been thinking about it all day, and he was someone she could think out loud with now without having to explain that she thought seriously about things. "Joe told me about his family's land," she said, "about the treaty." Ezekiel's face went still in the way it did when something mattered to him. "Joe's grandfather built that land," he said, "3 generations. And the government came through with a paper and a survey and took it like it was nothing, like the people on it were nothing." He paused. "There's not much I can do about government policy. But I can pay Joe what he's worth and treat him like a man, which is more than most around here bother to do." "It's not enough," Olive said honestly, "but it matters." "It doesn't fix anything," he agreed. "No, but the fact that you see it, that you don't look past it, that matters to me." He looked at her across the kitchen table where they were sitting after supper, the lamp between them casting warm light on the plain wood and the 2 coffee cups, and something passed between them in the silence that was too big to be named yet but was entirely real. "Olive," he said, and stopped. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. He had the particular difficulty of a man who is honest in action and not always fluent in words, who can show you something clearly but struggles sometimes to say it. "I want you to know," he said slowly, "that whatever your uncle thought he was arranging, whatever he thought you were, I want you to know that from the first day you were here, I've understood you as a gift." He paused, and she could see the effort of it, the careful choosing of words that were not cheap or easy. "Not as a solution to a practical problem, not as a housekeeper or a function. I mean a gift in the way that something arrives, and you realize the space it's filled was one you didn't know was empty." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window, the last of the summer evening light was fading gold along the mountains. Olive set down her coffee cup. She was not a woman who cried easily. Life had educated her thoroughly in the direction of composure, but her eyes were bright and she wasn't going to pretend they weren't. "I was told," she said, "that I was being sent somewhere I could be managed. That was the implication, that I was a difficulty being processed." She looked at him directly. "I have never in my adult life felt less like a difficulty than I have in this house." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. He did it simply, without drama, and his hand was warm and steady. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a long time, and the mountains outside the window went blue, then gray, then dark, and the stars came out over the territory, and neither of them said anything more because nothing more needed to be said yet. What had been said was enough to change everything, and they both understood it. July arrived with a thunderstorm that lasted 2 days, and took out a section of fence on the north end of the property. And Ezekiel was out in it with Pete and Joe from the first morning light. And Olive spent the first day in the house preserving and cooking, and managing the chicken coop between rain bursts. And the second day, she pulled on a borrowed hat and oilcloth coat, and went out to help. Because there were 3 fence posts, she could manage herself and leave the men for the sections that required 2 people. Ezekiel came around the corner of the north field and found her driving a post into the saturated earth with the kind of focused competence that apparently settled the matter for him more completely than any conversation could have. He stopped and watched her for a moment, and then he smiled, the full thing, which she still hadn't seen often enough to be immune to it, and said, "You're going to give Pete an inferiority complex." "Pete is 19 and has the energy of 3 healthy horses," she said, not looking up from the post. "He'll manage." He worked beside her for the rest of the afternoon, and something about working alongside someone in weather, getting soaked and muddy with the particular democracy of a task that doesn't care what you're wearing, stripped away the last of the careful politeness they'd been wearing around each other. They argued cheerfully about the best angle for the far fence posts. They traded tools without asking. When she slipped in the mud near the stream and he caught her arm, neither of them made anything of it except that his hand stayed a moment longer than strictly necessary, and she let it. That evening they were both thoroughly soaked and thoroughly happy about it in the uncomplicated way of people who have done a hard thing together well, and after they'd changed and come back to the kitchen, she made a soup from whatever was closest to hand, and he cut bread, and they sat across from each other and ate with the easy comfort of people who have stopped performing. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," he said. She waited. "I wrote to your uncle without writing to you first, which was wrong. I've been thinking about that since you arrived." He looked at her steadily. "I'd like to ask you now properly if you'd consider staying, not as a housekeeper, not as an arrangement, as my wife if you'd want that, if you'd want me." The soup was very good, the bread was fresh, the kitchen was warm and the rain had stopped and the wet mountains outside the window were clean and luminous in the clearing sky. "I came here convinced I was being discarded," she said carefully. "I came here prepared to be managed. I came here thinking I was going to spend my life organizing someone else's house to earn my keep." She paused. "And instead I found," she stopped, turned the right words over, making sure they were the right ones. "I found this, this life. This is the first place I have ever woken up in the morning looking forward to the day." "Is that a yes?" he asked, and there was a warmth in his voice that made her chest ache. "That is very much a yes," she said. He reached across the table again and took her hand again, and this time he turned it over and pressed his lips to the back of it, which was so old-fashioned and sincere that she loved him for it immediately and completely. She laughed, which surprised both of them, a real laugh, bright and unguarded, and he looked startled for a moment, and then he laughed too, and the kitchen filled up with it, this warm, ridiculous, unburdened sound, and it was perhaps the most honest moment either of them had had in years. They were married 6 weeks later in August, in the white church with the crooked shutter, which someone had fixed by then. The Reverend was a brisk, practical man named Father Aldous, who seemed to view weddings as pleasant interruptions in an otherwise demanding schedule, and the ceremony was simple and sincere. Clara Potts sat in the front row and cried with the unashamed enthusiasm of someone who had been hoping for exactly this outcome. Pete Calloway wore his best shirt and spent the whole service looking proud of something. Joe Rays stood at the back of the church and nodded with the deep, quiet approval of a man who has seen enough hard things to appreciate a good one. Most of the town was there, even some of the people who had been uncertain at first, who had watched Olive's arrival with the suspicion that towns develop for things that arrive from outside their natural order. Even they came, because she had been there for 3 months now, and in 3 months she had done things that the town could see and assess. She had organized a book lending exchange using the Reverend's library after learning that several of the smaller ranch families had children with no access to reading material. She had quietly paid the medical bill of a young widow named Sarah Finch, whose husband had died in a ranching accident, paying it through Clara so that Sarah wouldn't know where it came from. She had gone out during the thunderstorm to help with fence work. She had argued with Hellis Greer's pricing and taken her business elsewhere without drama. Hellis herself did not attend the wedding, which nobody mentioned and everyone noticed. But what the town mostly saw, and what gradually shifted opinion from watchful to warm, was the simple visible fact of Ezekiel Doyle. A man who had been quietly hollow for 3 years, who had run his ranch with grim competence and spoken to his neighbors with a courtesy that never quite reached his eyes. That man was visibly, specifically, unmistakably different now. He smiled more readily. He stood at social occasions with the easy posture of someone who wants to be where he is. He spoke of Olive in practical matters and in passing conversation with a quiet pride that wasn't possessive but was deeply, entirely certain. A territory can tell when a person has been properly received. It can tell the difference between a man doing his duty and a man doing his joy. On their wedding day, standing before Father Aldous in the plain, warm church with the whole territory as witness, Olive looked at Ezekiel and said her vows in a clear, steady voice, and he said his with his gray eyes on hers and his hands holding her hands with the same calm steadiness he brought to everything. And she thought, I was sent here as a burden. And the man across from me received me as a gift, and now I am becoming something I didn't know I could be, which is necessary and wanted and fully, entirely here. The reception was held in the church hall, and Clara had organized it with the thoroughness of someone who views hospitality as a civic duty. There was food enough for twice the people present. A fiddle player named Davis who had a slight weakness for his own product but could still play beautifully, and dancing that went on until the lanterns burned low. Ezekiel danced, which she hadn't known he could. He danced with the particular unself-conscious capability of a man who learned how because it seemed useful and then forgot to stop enjoying it. And when he pulled her into the center of the floor for the first waltz, and she found that his timing was perfect, and his hand at her waist was warm and sure, she decided that the universe had, after a somewhat circuitous route, delivered her exactly where she was supposed to be. You never told me you could dance, she said, somewhere in the second song. You never asked, he said. What else haven't you told me? He considered this with the seriousness he gave to most questions. I can also repair a clock. I speak enough Spanish to be useful and not enough to be confident. I cry sometimes when I read certain kinds of poetry, but I haven't told anyone that before now. She looked up at him. That may be the best thing you've said to me. More than the fence posts. More than the fence posts. He smiled, and she turned her face against his shoulder for a moment, just long enough to hold the feeling of this, the music and the warmth and the particular grace of being somewhere completely, cleanly right, before the dance carried them forward again. The summer rolled on, deep and golden, and their life together settled into itself with the quiet confidence of something that has found its shape. She learned more of the ranch, and he learned more of her. And the learning was endlessly interesting to both of them, which they both privately thought was the best possible sign. She was not a woman who was easily known. She had layers of her she had kept wrapped away during the years when revealing yourself too fully was a liability. But she unwrapped herself slowly and willingly, because he was patient and genuinely interested and never used anything she told him as ammunition. He told her about his childhood in western Kansas, about his father who had been a difficult man and his mother who had managed both the difficulty and the farm with equal competence, about how he'd come to Colorado at 21 with $300 and a specific idea of what he wanted his life to look like, and how it had mostly looked like that, except for the years after Margaret, which had been the hardest of his life. Do you think she'd have liked me? Olive asked once and immediately wasn't sure she should have, but he answered easily without awkwardness. I think she'd have liked you a great deal. She valued exactly the things you have: honesty, competence. Not bothering with what you don't respect. "That's a generous portrait. It's an accurate one," he said, and looked at her with the clear-eyed certainty that she had come to understand was just how he was, that the confidence he had in people he decided to trust was not performative but structural, bone-deep. In September, Joe Rays gave them a gift, a painting he'd done himself, small and precise, of the front porch of the Triple D with the mountains behind it, in the particular golden light of a late afternoon. It was beautiful in a way that made Olive's throat tight, not because of the skill of it, though it was skilled, but because of what it showed. The two chairs on the porch, the kitchen garden visible around the side, the mountains doing their perpetual reliable performance of being enormous and beautiful and there. She hung it in the kitchen where she could see it every day. Joe, when he saw it there, said nothing, but his nod was the longest and most emphatic nod she had ever received from him, which from Joe Rays was essentially a standing ovation. October brought the first frost and a letter from Marcus. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. She knew the handwriting before she opened it, and she sat with it in her hand for a moment on the porch in the cold morning air before she opened it, and she read it twice. Marcus wrote that he had heard she was married. He wrote, with the particular self-congratulatory tone of a man who will claim credit for anything that turned out well, that he was glad his arrangements had proved beneficial, and hoped she was behaving with the gratitude that such a fortunate situation warranted. He mentioned, toward the end, that he was having some difficulty with one of his business ventures and wondered whether her husband, being a man of property and some means, might be in a position to assist with a modest loan. She folded the letter with great care. She showed it to Ezekiel that evening. He read it, put it down, and looked at her across the kitchen table. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to write him back," she said, "and tell him that I'm grateful for my life, and that what he contributed to it was the accident of pointing me in the right direction while intending no such thing, and that we won't be providing any financial assistance. Should I add anything?" She thought about it. Tell him that the woman he described as unable to manage her circumstances with dignity is managing 400 head of cattle, a 3-acre kitchen garden, a household account, a lending library, and a happy marriage, and that she is doing all of it with considerable dignity and no particular longing for his approval. Ezekiel picked up his pen with the expression of someone who is going to enjoy writing this letter enormously. He composed it with her. She edited it once for tone. He had been more direct in certain places than she thought strategically advisable, and they sent it the following morning, and it felt like closing a door that had been letting cold air in for years. Marcus never wrote again. She thought about him sometimes with a complex feeling that was partly old hurt and partly something cleaner, the particular freedom of having outlasted the thing that was supposed to contain you. November came in cold and brilliant, the mountains capped white, the sky the deep saturated blue of the high country in winter. The cattle had been moved to the lower pastures. The kitchen garden had been put to bed. The cellar under the house was full of preserved things, 300 jars that she had counted and arranged by content, and she was pleased about this in a way she made no apology for. It was in November, on a clear, cold evening when Ezekiel had come in from the last check of the pastures, and they were sitting together in the parlor with the fire going and the oil lamp making the room amber, that she told him she was going to have a baby. She said it simply, watching his face, and watched the information travel through him like warmth through cold stone, gradual and then complete. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw everything in his face. The memory of loss that he couldn't separate from news like this. The new love that was different from what had come before and not lesser for it. The particular quality of hope that has learned from grief and is more careful and more real for that learning. He moved from his chair to sit beside her on the settee and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat there in the firelight, and he said quietly, "I'm going to be careful about being too happy." "Don't be," she said. "Be as happy as you are. We can't protect ourselves from what hasn't happened yet. All we have is now, and now is very good." He pressed his lips to her hair. "Olive, yes, I love you." She turned her face up toward him. "I love you," she said. "I have for a long time, I just didn't know how to say it until now." He kissed her, warm and unhurried, in the firelight, and the mountains stood outside in the dark doing what they always did, and the ranch was quiet around them, and the life they had built together was entirely, solidly, warmly real. Winter held the territory in its clean white grip for 4 months, and Olive loved it. She had expected to dread it, but she had not accounted for the particular beauty of snow on these mountains, or the way the cold air was so pure it almost hurt to breathe, or the way the long evenings gave you time for things that the busy seasons crowded out: reading by the fire, long conversations that started in one place and ended somewhere entirely different, the deep, unpressured intimacy of two people who have committed to each other and no longer need to perform anything. She corresponded with Clara Potts through the winter, and through Clara she stayed connected to the town's life, and she organized the second lending exchange delivery from the comfort of the Triple D kitchen, Pete Calloway riding the bundles into town on one of the milder days. The baby was due in late spring, which she calculated from the earliest possible date she could have been certain, and she approached the pregnancy with the same organized practicality she brought to everything, combined with a deeper, quieter reverence she hadn't expected to feel. She thought about her father often during these months, his patience, his certainty that good things were worth waiting for, his conviction that how you treated people was the full measure of a person. She thought she was beginning to understand the magnitude of what she'd received, not just the ranch and the life, but Ezekiel himself, who was more than she had known to ask for. He was attentive during the winter in the steady, unobtrusive way that was characteristic of him. Not hovering, not making her feel like a patient, but present and aware, coming in from the cold and finding her by the fire and sitting beside her with a naturalness that said simply, "This is where I want to be." He had bought 2 books on obstetrics from Denver and read them with the same careful attention he brought to his irrigation reports, which made her alternately laugh and love him acutely. "You don't need to memorize the medical texts," she told him. "The doctor is 2 hours away," he said simply. She couldn't argue with that. Spring came slowly and then all at once, as Colorado springs tended to, and by April the kitchen garden was being prepared for planting again, and the cattle were moving back to the upper pastures, and the territory was warming up in earnest. Olive was large and deliberate in her movements by now, and she had come to terms with the fact that she would need to accept help for the things she could not reach, and the things that required bending, which was most things, which she bore with moderate grace. Clara Potts had arranged to come stay for the lying-in, which Olive was grateful for with a depth of gratitude she couldn't entirely express, because Clara was the kind of woman whose competence in a crisis was as comfortable and reliable as good weather gear. The baby came on a warm morning in the first week of May, 1879, at approximately the time the sun cleared the mountain ridge to the east and sent its first full light across the ranch. It was a boy, healthy and loud and indignant about his arrival in a way that the doctor who'd made the 2-hour journey said was an excellent sign. Ezekiel held him in the kitchen afterward, while Clara fussed and organized and the doctor packed his bag, and he held him with the careful, absolute attention of a man who understands that he is holding something irreplaceable. "What's his name?" Clara asked. They had discussed this. They had discussed it on winter evenings and spring mornings, and they had arrived at the name the way you arrive at something true, not by inventing it but by recognizing it. "Thomas," Olive said from the bed where she was propped against several pillows, feeling thoroughly exhausted and thoroughly triumphant. "Thomas James Doyle." "After your father," Ezekiel said, looking at her with those gray eyes that were so bright in this moment she could hardly look at them directly. "After my father," she confirmed. Clara said, "That is a good name for a Colorado boy," and reached for Thomas James Doyle as if she'd been waiting for him specifically. The news traveled through Harding Flats in the way that news travels in small western towns, which is thoroughly and quickly. And by the afternoon of Thomas's birth there were people stopping by the Triple D with food, casseroles, and bread, and a pie that Pete Calloway had somehow personally baked, and which was surprisingly excellent. Joe Reyes stood at the door and looked at the baby with the gentle attention he gave to things he considered genuinely worthwhile, and said to Ezekiel, "He looks like a good one." And Ezekiel said, "He does." And they both looked satisfied in the way of men who do not need to say everything. Even some of the women who had been reserved about Olive, who had watched her arrival with suspicion and her industry with the particular difficulty of people who did not want to approve of something they'd been prepared to disapprove of, even several of them came by, and their coming said everything their previous reservation hadn't, because they brought food. And in this territory, in this time, bringing food was the unambiguous statement, "You are one of us. You belong here. We are glad you are here." It was Clara who later told Olive about the conversation at the general store the week after Thomas was born. The conversation where Ida Henderson, of the fair pricing Hendersons, had said to several of the assembled women of Harding Flats, "I don't know what that uncle of hers was thinking, sending her west like she was a problem to be solved. The woman is practically holding this town together." And that several of the women had agreed, and that even Harriet Caldwell, who had been among the most reserved about Olive's arrival, had said, "I think we misunderstood the situation when she arrived. I think we misjudged her." And Hellis Greer, Olive asked Clara. Clara's expression was so carefully neutral it was almost a smile. "Hellis is taking orders from Henderson's now too." Olive laughed, and it was the good, bright, unguarded laugh that had first echoed through the Triple D kitchen on the evening Ezekiel asked her to marry him, and Clara laughed with her, and Thomas, in his basket by the window, opened his eyes at the sound as though he was trying to locate the source of something that interested him. The summer of 1879 was the best summer of Olive Vaughn Doyle's life, which was not something she would have predicted or dared to hope for in April of the previous year. Thomas grew with the enthusiastic commitment that healthy babies apply to the enterprise of becoming larger, and he had his father's gray eyes and his mother's disposition toward forming firm opinions about things, and he was adored by everyone on the Triple D with an intensity that would have been embarrassing if it had been directed at anyone capable of embarrassment. Pete Calloway became something like an honorary uncle, incapable of passing the baby without stopping to make some noise at him that Thomas consistently found acceptable. Joe Reyes taught Thomas, when he was old enough to notice such things, the names of the birds that lived in the grassland around the ranch, teaching them in both English and Spanish because Joe believed a person should know things in more than one language, and Olive agreed with him entirely and made sure to learn them herself as well. The town, by summer, had completed its recalibration. Olive was a figure it had collectively, gradually, arrived at appreciating, not grudgingly but honestly, the way you come to appreciate something you didn't initially understand. The book lending program had grown into something with a proper structure and a growing collection, and it served not just the ranch families in the Northern Territory, but also, quietly, several of the Ute families who had been displaced to the South, whose children Clara had brought to Olive's attention, and whose access to learning she had quietly made possible. This was the thing that completed the territory's understanding of her, if you asked Clara, who would say it clearly and without equivocation. Olive Vaughn Doyle had seen people that most of the town had practiced looking past, and she had done something about it without making a spectacle of herself, without requiring credit, without even particularly discussing it. She had just done it, the way she did everything, with clear eyes and capable hands, and the particular dignity of someone who has never in her life been able to afford anything less than the truth. Ezekiel had known this about her more or less from the beginning. He had understood, standing in the road in Harding Flats that April afternoon, watching her step down from the stage with one trunk and a valise and her chin at precisely the right angle, that he was looking at someone of quality. He hadn't known then what to do with that knowledge, hadn't known how the life he was already living would make room for her, but he had known, and the knowing had turned out to be exactly right. He told her this one evening in the autumn of 1879, sitting on the porch with Thomas asleep inside and the stars doing their enormous nightly performance overhead, and he told it the way he told most important things, carefully, precisely, like a man who has thought about something for a long time and has waited until he has it exactly correct. "The day you arrived," he said, "I was worried." "Were you?" She looked at him sideways. "I was worried you would be either too fragile for this life or too certain that you were too good for it. I was ready to be patient about either one." He paused. "And then I watched you get off that stage and I thought, this is a woman who has decided to be present wherever she is. And I thought whatever Marcus Vaughn thought he was doing sending her west, he had done me a considerable favor." She looked at the stars. The mountains were dark shapes against a sky full of light, and the ranch around them was quiet and alive. "My father," she said slowly, "used to say that people reveal themselves by what they do when they're not being watched. That the best parts of a person are the ones they don't perform." She turned to look at him. "I've watched you for a year and a half now, Ezekiel. I've watched you when no one is looking. You are consistent all the way through. I don't think you know how rare that is." He was quiet for a moment. Then he took her hand, the simple, straightforward gesture that had been the language of something between them since that first evening at the kitchen table, and held it. "I know what I have," he said. "So do I," she said. They sat together in the autumn dark, their hands joined, the ranch breathing around them, the stars overhead indifferent and beautiful, the mountains standing where they had always stood and would always stand, and the life they had built together between them like a fire that had grown from something careful and tentative into something that would last. The years that followed were good years in the way that good years are, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary griefs and complications of a life being lived fully, but solid and warm at their core, with the particular quality of happiness that is not the absence of hard things, but the presence of something strong enough to hold them. In the spring of 1881, Olive discovered she was expecting again, and told Ezekiel on the same porch where they had their most important conversations, watching the same mountains in the same light. And his response was identical in quality to the first time, that deep-moving warmth she loved in him, the careful hope of a man who has been shaped by loss into someone who holds good things with both hands. The second baby was a girl, born in December of that year, in a snowstorm that blocked the road to town so completely that Dr. Haverson couldn't make it, and Clara Potts, who had been staying at the ranch in anticipation of this exact possibility, since the doctor's road became unreliable in heavy snow, delivered her with calm competence, and declared her the most straightforward arrival she'd ever attended. She had Olive's brown eyes and Ezekiel's quiet expression, and they named her Ruth Margaret Doyle, the Margaret for the woman Ezekiel had loved and lost, because Olive had suggested it herself, because she was exactly that kind of person, and because she understood that love does not replace love but accumulates it. Thomas, by now 2.5, regarded his sister with the philosophical uncertainty of a small person encountering a large change, and eventually reached the conclusion around the time Ruth smiled at him for the first time, which she did early and specifically in his direction as though she had identified him as her primary person, that she was worth keeping. By 1882, the Triple D had expanded. Ezekiel had bought the parcel of land adjacent to his northern fence line from a rancher heading back to Texas, and Pete Calloway had been promoted to foreman, which he took to with the enthusiasm of someone who was born to have responsibility and simply needed to be given some. Joe Ray's remained the most valued hand on the property, And when Ezekiel built a small, proper house on the eastern corner of the land and offered it to Joe at no cost, Joe said nothing for a long moment and then said, "This land," and stopped, and Ezekiel said, "It's yours. As long as you want it," and Joe nodded, and that was the conversation, but both of them knew everything it meant. The book lending program had grown into a proper library, housed in a building that the town had collectively constructed in the spring of 1882 on a lot that Marcus Greer Helois's husband, who had come independently to conclusions about Olive that differed somewhat from his wife's, had donated with the specific statement that it was about time Harding Flats had something to be proud of besides its cattle numbers. It was at the library opening, standing with Thomas on one side and Ruth on her hip and Ezekiel's hand at the small of her back, that Olive looked out at the assembled town, the ranchers and the shopkeepers and their families, Clara Potts in the front row as she always was, Joe Rays at the side with the quiet man's preference for edges, Pete Calloway standing very straight and proud in his good shirt. Even the Ute women she had quietly insured could use the library equally with everyone else. And she felt the full weight of what had happened to her, of where the story had gone from that cold morning in Philadelphia when she'd walked out of a house that didn't want her toward a life she couldn't have imagined. She had been sent west as a burden. She understood that clearly, saw it without bitterness, understood Marcus Vaughn's calculation exactly for what it was, an inconvenient woman disposed of with the efficiency of a man who had decided she was not worth the space she took up. And she had arrived in a territory she didn't know, to a man she'd never met, carrying nothing but a trunk and a valise, and the particular quality of a person who had decided to be present wherever they were placed. And Ezekiel Doyle had received her like a gift. She had watched him do it day by day, in the specific accumulated moments of their life together, in the way he cleaned the bedroom before she arrived, in the coffee handed to her without asking, in the way he stood between her and Helois Greer's cruelty without hesitation, in the bean steaks and the fence posts and the porch evenings and the firelight conversations and the winter books and the hands held, and the vows said in a plain white church with one fixed shutter, in the naming of a daughter after his first wife, in the land given to Joe Rays, in the library built in a Colorado town that was slowly becoming something better than it might have been. He received her like a gift. And the whole territory eventually understood. She turned to look at him, this man she loved, with the full unadorned truth of someone who had been without home for long enough to understand the specific miracle of having one, and he was already looking at her, the way he often was, with those gray eyes that saw her clearly and completely and were glad of what they saw. "You all right?" he said quietly, under the sound of the Reverend's speech. "Perfectly fine," she said, which was what she always said, and he knew, as he always knew, that she meant it entirely. He leaned down and pressed his lips briefly to her temple, warm and unhurried, and Ruth grabbed a piece of his collar with her small, determined fist, and Thomas leaned against Olive's leg with the comfortable weight of a child who has never needed to worry about whether he's wanted, and the mountains stood behind the town in the clean October light, and Harding Flats stood at the edge of a good future, and Olive Vaughn Doyle stood inside a life that fit her exactly, with all its difficulty and all its grace, and was entirely, immovably, perfectly at home. They walked back to the Triple D that afternoon along the road she had first traveled in a wagon, with her hands folded in her lap and her chin level and her eyes very carefully dry. And the light was the long gold of October, and the mountains were doing what they always did in that light, which was to be magnificent without effort. And Thomas ran ahead on the road because he was 3 years old and the road was in front of him, and that was sufficient reason. And Ezekiel carried Ruth on his shoulder and reached for Olive's hand without looking, and she gave it without looking back because they didn't need to look. They knew where the other one was. They had always known, she thought, from that first afternoon on the street in Harding Flats when two strangers stood together and looked at each other, and something began that had no name then but had every name now. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She looked at the mountains, the ranch coming into view ahead, the red barn and the stone house and the kitchen garden put to bed for winter, the 2 chairs on the porch, Joe's small house on the eastern edge of the property with smoke coming from its chimney, the fence lines running out to the horizon straight and true. "I'm thinking," she said, "that I would very much like to do this for the rest of my life." His hand tightened on hers once, certain and complete. "So would I," he said. Thomas turned on the road ahead and shouted something about a hawk that he'd spotted in the blue, and Ruth reached toward the sky from her father's shoulder, and the afternoon light came across the Colorado grassland in long, warm rivers, and Olive Vaughn Doyle walked home.